And, we need to apply the same rules to the public sector, to the royal family, as to any other part of the public sector, whether it's a parliament or whether it's the House of Lords, whether it's councils or whatever. There should be no difference in that, and there should be no different taxation arrangements either.
A slew of revelations over the rent arrangements of the royal family has triggered a committee of MPs to look into properties owned by the Crown Estate. The Times revelation that Prince Edward pays a peppercorn rent for the 120-room Bagshot Park and Princess Alexandra shells out a mere £2,200 a year for the Grade 2 listed thatched house lodge in Richmond has only compounded the need for transparency following the disclosure of Andrew Mountbatten Windsor's own peppercorn agreement for the Royal Lodge at Windsor. There's an awful lot of peppercorns flying about. According to my next guest, though, the Public Accounts Committee should be widening their investigation into royal finances, not least because of an investigation published in the Times today claiming that Andrew lobbied Middle Eastern royal families for his own gain, only strengthening that case. Norman Baker is a former Liberal Democrat Home Office Minister and author of And What Do You Do? What the Royal Family Don't Want You to Know. He joins me now. Norman, do you suspect that the revelations so far around royal rent agreement are really just the tip of the iceberg?
I do. I think that once MPs begin to look into these matters in any detail, which I hope they will do, then they'll find it's like a ball of string and they pull at one end and a whole lot will unravel, because the elements to do with property alone are extraordinary. You've referred to some of them, but you might also refer to the 52 grace and favour properties that the King has demanded from the Crown Estate. You might refer to the 272 other grace and favour properties which the palace has been involved in, which you won't give details of. You might refer to the fact that the royals themselves have got a property portfolio which is extraordinary in terms of its breadth and numbers. And you might also refer to the fact that the peppercorn rents are being applied is a loss to the taxpayer, because that means Crown Estate money, which is a public body, the Crown Estate, it gives less money to the taxpayer, and therefore we are indirectly subsidising some very rich members of the royal family.
Yeah, well, with that in mind, the peppercorn rents in particular, should those agreements be brought up to market value?
Of course you should, and we should have open transparency about market rents, which are applied to all the grace and favour properties. They should also be at market value. And indeed, I would go further and suggest that those peppercorn rents which have been applied, there ought to be retrospective action to claim some money back for the taxpayer.
You say that the most recent count of the King's grace and favour homes was from 1993, I think, and it amounted to 272 properties. Yes. We've got a very good visual guide to grace and favour homes on thetimes.com at the moment. I'm just going to sell that one to you there. It's the 21st century. Money's tight. Even if you're a fan of the royal family and appreciate the soft power argument about their role in modern Britain, is it acceptable for the royal family to own this money? And should they be able to shield the exact count from public view?
No, they shouldn't. And first of all, the royal family has managed to exempt themselves largely from Freedom of Information Act, which I was given the assurance by a Labour minister in 2000 would not happen. If we had full information, then we'd have more. It's been very difficult to find out what I've found out. In my latest book, Royal Mint National Debt, which the Times kindly serialised a couple of weeks ago, I've gone into as much detail as I can, but the 1993 figure you referred to, for example, came from the previous Public Accounts Committee investigation back then. The palace won't even tell me how many grace and favour properties exist. It's quite extraordinary for them to do that. And, we need to apply the same rules to the public sector, to the royal family, as to any other part of the public sector, whether it's a parliament or whether it's the House of Lords, whether it's councils or whatever. There should be no difference in that, and there should be no different taxation arrangements either. Why is it, for example, there was no inheritance tax paid by Charles on the vast amount of money and goods which he inherited from his mother in a private capacity? I'm not talking about Buckingham Palace and so on. I'm talking about the Fabergé eggs, the strings of racehorses, the Monet paintings, and so on. Why is no inheritance tax paid on that? Why is there a different taxation regime for one of the richest families in the country?
Very good questions that our readers are responding to online now. I can tell you the Times investigation that I mentioned, Norman, found that Andrew's been sending messages to the Crown Prince of Bahrain,
yes,
and an Omani government advisor for his own business ventures. Now, these are two administrations whose conduct is not always at peace with our values in the UK. Should there be stricter rules around members of the royal family using their position to further their interests?
Well, absolutely, there should be. There should be a declaration of gifts, for example, which I argue for in my book, so we know what engagements they've had, as we do with MPs. I mean, there was a great fuss over Keir Starmer's glasses, which aren't worth very much money, I don't think, but we knew about those. We knew about the football tickets, which he and other members of the government and MPs generally were securing from the Premier League at the time they were looking at a regulator. We know these things about MPs. We don't know what happens with the royal family in the same way, and we should do. The same rules should apply to them. As far as Andrew's concerned in the Middle East, he used his position as trade envoy for 10 years or more to engage with them for his own benefit, not for the benefit of this country, but for his own benefit. There's a list at the back of my new book of all the engagements he undertook over that period of time. And you'll find Bahrain and Oman and the Middle Eastern countries and countries, the Stans, countries with dictators and unpleasant regimes, feature very, very large in his travel arrangements.
That was Norman Baker, the former Liberal Democrat Home Office Minister and author of And What Do You Do? What the Royal Family Don't Want You to Know. Norman, thank you for that.
Correspondence between Andrew and the Crown Prince of Bahrain, unearthed as part of a Times investigation, shows for the first time how Andrew tried to capitalise on his royal contacts in the Middle East to further his business interests in the region. James Beale, Deputy Investigations Editor for the Times, is with us. Hi there, James.
Hi.
Talk us through the messages that you've seen. These were from June last year.
That's correct. As you say, this is a story about Andrew Mountbatten Windsor using his royal and political contacts to further his business interests in the Middle East. The messages we've seen are from Andrew to the Crown Prince of Bahrain and to a foreign trade advisor for the Omani government. Now, in these messages, Andrew is talking about how through fantastic serendipity, he's been introduced to a team from a Dutch firm called Startup Bootcamp who were looking to buy his business, Pitch Palace, which he created when he was a working royal. And the messages go on to ask if his new business partners can come to Bahrain and Oman to invest in businesses and do deals with them.
That's interesting because I vaguely remember Pitch at Palace. It was what was going on in the background, wasn't it, of that controversial Newsnight interview. There was footage of him doing one of those events at Windsor Castle, sort of Dragon's Den startup style thing. I'm not sure I really knew it was a business per se. I thought it was a kind of incentive to encourage entrepreneurship, but he had a stake in it, did he?
He was named on Companies House as the controller of one of the arms of Pitch. And as you say, it was a Dragon's Den startup competition, basically, where entrepreneurs could present their ideas to potential investors. And it was considered as a possible source of income for the former prince. After he was cut off financially by the king. And we do know that the palace were happy for him to enter into talks to sell Pitch Palace if it was done in a legitimate way. But obviously there are questions over whether they knew this would mean Andrew would lean on his contacts in order to do so.
I mean, I suppose, were he here, his argument presumably would be... if he did sell the business, as you suggest, that the profits would then subsidise his lifestyle, i.e. not from the public purse, i.e. the very thing he's constantly being asked to do, and that, he knows royals because until very recently he is a royal. That's who he knows. So there's nothing odd about him contacting another royal and saying, are you interested?
It's a tricky question, but ultimately you have somebody who is leaning on his past contacts because he's no longer a working royal. So these are people he's met when he's carrying out his duties on behalf of the UK. And now you have him contacting those same people, asking about deals that will make him, or likely to make him money. So it's a tricky question, and it leaves him with further questions to answer.
And it's perhaps not surprising to Andrew watchers that it's Bahrain that's in this mix, because there were reports, weren't there, that he might move there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, he's got an extensive relationship with the Bahraini royal family. Him and the Crown Prince have been pictured together at Royal Ascot. He's visited the country a number of times, most recently in 2022, where he undertook, I think, his first visit after the Newsnight scandal. His first overseas visit was to Bahrain, and he's been hosted by the Crown Prince and the King a number of times.
It's fascinating to me that as recently as 18 months ago, Andrew still clearly believed that he had something to sell. I mean, the whole thing is kind of pinned around his personality, isn't it? His former reputation, that his reputation hadn't been entirely traduced already. Do you think that, just psychologically, in terms of the man, because you've spent a long time looking into this, do you think that shows sort of resilience or delusion?
I'm not sure. The messages were certainly quite upbeat to the Crown Prince, and these were, as we said, June 2024, and he was mired in scandal. The Epstein story was still mushrooming at the time, but he clearly felt that he had something to offer. And in fact, one of the messages he says to the Crown Prince, look, I haven't been sitting idly by, and I've met these guys who are looking to buy my business, and can we come to Bahrain?
I mean, it is a story, isn't it, about blurred lines, about where the duty ended, because he was a trade envoy as well, wasn't he? Although that was some time ago.
That's correct, yeah.
And where his personal interests begin. I mean, I suppose he would say, well, there was a philanthropic edge to it as well. He was encouraging young entrepreneurs.
But now we see it in a different light, when he is now not a working member of the royal family, and he has to fund this lifestyle that few of us can imagine. But it seems like one of the ways he felt to do that was to lean on his contacts that he'd previously made when he was a working royal.
And we saw what happened, as I alluded to earlier, after that Newsnight broadcast with Pitch at Palace in the UK. Do you think that this story could be an obstacle for Andrew's continuing involvement in the Middle East? They won't want a spotlight thrown upon that either.
Yeah, I think his reputation continues to nosedive in lots of different parts of the world. The Middle East and China are historically where his reputation has been better, but as the more stories emerge, that will change.
And just give us a sense, James, on how long you've been working on this investigation. How do you piece this puzzle together? We've
been working on it for a number of months. We've basically been pulling the threads of the different businesses that we knew he'd been involved with. And we've spoken to a number of different sources for the story. And indeed, in the story, we go into a little bit the key figures that were helping him sell Pitch at Palace, including his former senior advisor, Dominic Hampshire.
And is there more to come? I know you should never ask a journalist that, because there probably is, and you probably can't tell us, but I feel like I should ask.
There will be more stories to come, inevitably, on Andrew Mountbatten Windsor, as there often is.